We're starting now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second in a series of talk media forums on U.S.-China relations that is being presented by Talkers Magazine and the Epoch Times. I'm Michael Harrison, the publisher of Talkers, and I just want to say it's my pleasure and a privilege to work with the Epoch Times as our partner in this series of forums. The Epoch Times is probably the best source of information, unbiased, real, firsthand information about the delicate and complicated subject of U.S.-China relations. I also believe, as somebody who has been involved in chronicling and overviewing and reporting on and being involved in talk media since the golden age of radio, that anybody involved in talk show hosting, commentating, being a pundit, news journalism in the United States should know as much as possible about the relationship between the U.S. and China, because it has been, although not fully recognized, it is beginning to be recognized and will continue to be for years to come recognized as one of the most important topics that we deal with in terms of politics, public policy, and American foreign policy. China and the U.S. are involved in a very complex dance, a very complex relationship, and it's one that I personally think the story needs to be told on a regular basis. That's why we welcome our relationship with the Epoch Times. And a few words about our friends at the Epoch Times. It's one of the fastest growing independent news media in America. It's nonpartisan and dedicated to truthful reporting. It's a unique news organization, free from the influence of any government, any corporation, any political party. And its goal is to bring readers accurate information so they can form their own opinions about the most significant topics of our time. Obviously, they deal with more than just China. But the Chinese connection is of particular influence and importance, because it was founded, the Epoch Times was founded in the U.S. in 2000 in response to communist repression and censorship in China. Its founders, the Epoch Times founders, were Chinese Americans who themselves had fled communism. So it has a very interesting and unique background. And they sought to create an independent media to bring the world uncensored and truthful information. It's received a number of awards. And at this point, in 2019, the Epoch Times Media Network currently covers 21 languages in 33 countries. One of the ironies of the relationship between China and the U.S. as depicted in the American media is that because Americans are basically not that familiar with the intricacies of Chinese culture and the Chinese political situation, the Chinese government, which is a totalitarian communist regime in business now for 70 years, which is several generations, has been able to control the narrative on what Americans think about China. And there are some things about China that are valid, and then there's some things that are a little bit out of context. But the Epoch Times has been a wonderful place to go, and especially for people in my business, to find out the truth about what's going on. Chinese are the most numerous in terms of the population of the earth. China is the most populated country, and Chinese are all over the world. The Chinese American population is gigantic and torn between the traditions of their culture that goes back 5,000 years and the assimilating into the freedom of American democracy, which they wholeheartedly want to embrace, but it isn't the easiest thing to do. So there's a lot to this, and we're going to try to clarify as much of that as possible. We have three distinguished experts from the Epoch Times on our panel. We have Dr. Dana Chang, who grew up in China. After graduating from one of the top 5 universities in China, she came to the United States on a full scholarship for a PhD program in physics. She got her doctorate degree and worked in the insurance industry as an actuary for more than 10 years. And then in 2000, after observing an onslaught of Chinese Communist Party propaganda and their persecution of the Falun Gong religious group, she and a few friends decided to start an independent Chinese media, and that is the Epoch Times, and she's been leading the China News Reporting Department for the past 15 years. So Dana is a great journalist and a pioneer in the effort that I have described to you. The other member of our panel from the Epoch Times is Joshua Phillips. Philip, if you could raise your hand. And Joshua is an award-winning investigative reporter, a senior editor at the Epoch Times. He's a recognized expert on unrestricted warfare, asymmetrical hybrid warfare, subversion, and historical perspectives on today's issues. He has more than a decade of research and investigations on the Chinese Communist Party, its subversion, and related topics, and he has a unique insight into the global threat that China presents and the political landscape. And also from the Epoch Times, next to Joshua, is Nan Su, a gentleman I've had the opportunity now to get to know better as we've done several of these forums and have met at events. He's a journalist for more than 16 years, and one of the things that I personally find fascinating about Nan Su is that he conducted a radio talk show in San Francisco for a number of years in Chinese for the Chinese immigrants. And that, just to me, is incredibly interesting. He understands that bridge, the lifeline between the Chinese-American experience and the experience of what's happening in the homeland in China, and has been a source of tremendous information for the Chinese people here about what's happening back home, and for Americans as to know what's going on with the Chinese community. So I welcome our partners and friends from the Epoch Times. Thank you very much for being here. John Fredericks, if you just acknowledge, because we don't have nameplate. John is a senior media executive, over 35 years of experience. All of the talk show hosts here are members of the Talkers Heavy 100, which means they are among the 100 most important radio talk show hosts in America. John is a newspaper publisher, an advertising director, an editorial page director, a TV host, a commentator, very, very connected to the campaign of the President of the United States. He served as co-chair and then chairman of the Trump for President Virginia campaign in 2015 and 2016. He's a White House correspondent. He covers news of the White House for international publications and media. He owns a radio station or two in Virginia and is the president and founder of the John Fredericks Radio Network, which means he's beholden to nobody but his own conscience, which in today's media is a big deal. And it's good to have you here. Thank you, John. Next to John is Doug Steffen. Doug Steffen is heard on hundreds of radio stations across the country in the mornings. He, too, is independent. He does not work for any of the major corporations. He is a major corporation. He has the second longest running syndicated radio show in America, second only to Rush Limbaugh by something like 2 or 3 weeks, if I'm correct.
2 or 3 months.
2 or 3 months. Okay, sorry, fake news. But Doug is an entrepreneur. He is a friend of youngsters and new people coming into the media business, has given many a start. And also, in addition to this, he is a small family farmer. Doug runs a farm in Framingham, Massachusetts. He spends half his day milking cows and building the infrastructure of a farm. He's been doing it for years. He is an example of artificial intelligence. He is an android. I don't know where he gets his energy, but he's a remarkable man and is probably one of the most knowledgeable people, not only about the news and what's going on, but about the relationship between the U.S. and China when it comes to one of the sensitive points, and that is agriculture. And Doug, I was just informed by Victoria Jones, who is in our audience today, and president of the DC radio company, that as we're speaking, news is breaking, so I'm not fully informed. This is what life is like doing any kind of media presentation in 2019. There's always breaking news. And the word is that the negotiators at the table between China and the U.S. in terms of trade tariffs have decided to, I believe, forestall the trade tariffs going into effect till either after December 15th or on December 15th to try to get China. The U.S. is playing hardball to try to get China to be a little bit more open about buying American agricultural products. One of the sensitive areas in terms of pretty universal support among the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans, has been President Trump's handling of the China trade war issue. There seems to be a general consensus, except one of the sore points has been with the farmers and the agriculture. So Doug will be talking about that. To Doug's left is a very, very popular.
Physically to his left. I don't know about ideologically.
Yeah,
Probably to your left.
that's a hard one with both of you because you know it's fun.
I'm sitting in the middle of the table.
You know, they're both making jokes, but the truth of the matter is it is difficult sometimes to know who's left and who's right. As publisher of Talkers, I have always tried to maintain a independent ideology. However, if what I say is one molecule to the left of somebody who's proudly to the right, they call me a liberal. And if I'm one molecule to the right of somebody who is an ardent liberal or a progressive, they think I'm a conservative. Some people don't like me because I'm friends with people from the other side, and I think that's a really sad thing. I have had more and more of that. How could you be friends with that person? And one of the things that I've learned in the media is don't judge a book by its cover, because some of the nicest people may be the people with whom you disagree with politically, and vice versa. Larry O'Connor brings a tremendous background to the stage of public policy discussion. He's a great talk show host. He's heard every afternoon on WMAL, the leading talk radio station in Washington, D.C. He's also heard daily a different show, midday, on KABC in Los Angeles, which he does from the nation's capital. So he's truly a bi-coastal force in the talk radio business. He brings a combination of fun personality and serious political discussion to the table, and I would not ever describe you as by your ideology. You're a right wing.
Hard to pin down.
Yeah, and I think that's
But
good.
I'm sorry you've lost friends over being my friend.
It wasn't. It was just a few people.
Okay, all right.
It was just a few, and of course that's it. I think we. Oh yeah, and Dr. Sebastian Gorka, who's says he'll join us. He apologizes. He's tied up at the White House right now at a meeting.
That excuse again.
Yeah, I was having an audience with the Pope, but I made it. Sebastian Gorka, to avoid having to go through a whole introduction, he is nationally syndicated on the Salem radio network. He's a newcomer to talk radio, but on a lot of radio stations, and was a deputy advisor to the president for almost a year, bringing his background in foreign policy to the table. And now, as I said, since leaving the White House, he is heard on radio. I'd like to start with...
Any questions for Dr. Gorka, close your eyes and I can just do a good impression of him.
That's
and
very
give
good.
you an answer as if Dr. Gorka were here.
We can use that on the audio presentation
Yes,
of this
Michael,
panel.
thank you. So delightful to be here.
I'd like to start with Nan Su. Nan, could you just tell us, and everybody please keep all remarks to under 2.5 to 3 minutes so that we can keep this thing moving. One of the things I find fascinating is your understanding of the nuances of what it's like to be a Chinese-American immigrant in the United States trying to make a life free of the communist repression in Beijing, yet not losing the culture of being Chinese and still being able to assimilate. If you can tell us a bit about that.
Thank you for that question, Michael. Chinese culture actually have a lot of, have one bottom line similarity with American, which is very friendly to all religions. Traditional Chinese culture believe that the humanity follow the earth follow the heaven, and heaven follows Tao. And Tao is the wisdom of the universe, or you can say it's the wisdom of the Creator. Now, it was interesting that it was a philosophy, not a religion, because it stopped right there. It never defined who was the creator and how he did it. So therefore, Chinese culture, because it started by Taoist philosophy, so it's a very friendly to all religion. And later, when other philosophies like Buddhism, like Catholicism, like Christianity went to China, they quickly become very welcome and popular. But however, people quickly realize after coming to the United States that we have lost all that. Now, after the Chinese regime took over control of China, they wipe out all the traditions, including Taoist philosophy, Confucianism, Buddhism, and all the religions under suppression, including Catholicism, Christianity. And what happened is right now in China, you have a two level of a social setup. Once you wipe out all the ethical and moral standard that's above the government. See, in the ancient time, it was required the emperor, or you say the government of China, to treat earth as his mother and heaven as his father. So you have multiple layers of ethical and moral standard above the government, like earth, like heaven, like a Tao. But now in China, what happened is after all those moral standards and ethical standards being wiped out, you have two levels of a social setup. That's people and government. So in that kind of a social setup, you basically, government is the one making the decision to decide the standard, to measure what's right, what's wrong, what's good, and what's bad. So Chinese student doesn't even set up, the Chinese government doesn't even set up the standard. Chinese government is the standard. Wherever they do, it's the standard. So how can you challenge them? You don't even have a platform to form the public opinion against the government. So that's the problem of China. And it's not only create a challenge to society of China, but it also create a challenge for the international society. Take a look at the trade war. Why, we are dealing with China in so very hard way, in this trade negotiation. Everything they promised was no different. Everything on the negotiation table, it's no different than what they promised when they joined WTO almost 20 years ago, right? Why? Because they are the standard. They do it left and right, wherever they want to.
Let me jump in on here, Nan. How difficult is it for the average Chinese person living in the United States today to balance the allegiance to China to their new country, the United States? Is this a difficult thing to do?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, a lot of people doing business and travel to China, even when they go to China, they find the Chinese people are always friendly to Americans. Americans are very welcome, but however, it's the regime they have to deal with. Mm-hmm. So the two cultures have a fundamental similarity.
All right, let's move over to Joshua Phillip. Joshua, how influential is the communist regime in Beijing in terms of the lives of the Chinese people who live in the Chinatowns here in the United States?
So the Chinese Communist Party works extensively on switching the allegiances of the leaders of the Chinese communities. And it does this mainly through financial interest, business interest, and these types of things. So part of my work has been investigating what they call the United Front Department. It's different names, United Front Work Department, United Front, and basically just United Front. One of the former branches of it, which they recently merged in, was the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, just to get the names off the table. But basically, here's what it does. It goes into these Chinese communities, and the governing bodies of Chinatowns, the reason Chinatowns are so hard to crack, the reason they're so insulated, is because they're often governed by what you call tongs, or fraternal organizations. When the Chinese Communist Party can switch the allegiance of these tongs, the Chinatown becomes essentially an overseas branch of the Chinese government, which can then serve its interests. And this requires a little bit of background. So traditional Chinese society, there was essentially no government below the county level. Below that, just like American society, you had families, churches, these types of things, communities, and then also fraternal organizations, guilds, family organizations, and these things that worked as kind of the bottom-up form of government. People governed themselves below the county level, essentially. When the Chinese people immigrated to other countries, they maintained those structures. And so Chinatowns were always kind of insulated, self-governing communities, which is why they're so hard to understand for outsiders and so hard to get into for outsiders. The Chinese Communist Party realized that this could be strategically valuable. And so when it created the United Front Department, it goes into these communities, you gain control of the tongs, you gain control of the communities, you can then threaten people, you can control people. In my own work, I met people who said they said they can make me disappear. I've had people tell me that their family members get threatened. There are Chinese Americans, people on American soil, even second and third generation Chinese, who are afraid of speaking out against persecution in mainland China because they believe that they will be persecuted or their families will be persecuted, even on American soil, because of the United Front.
Even on American soil, that's the key to that.
Well, and the important thing, too, is under a lot of the tongs, some of them, there are good ones and there are bad ones. They're not all bad. But under some of the real bad ones, you have the Chinese mafia. These are the triads, human traffickers, drug traffickers.
So what you're saying by
counterfeiters.
bad or good, you mean they're not necessarily in league with the Communist Party, that there are tongs that are in league with the idea.
Some are pro-Taiwan, some are non-politically affiliated, some
Right.
are just like workers' unions.
Is it a problem in understanding how to navigate the intricacies, the nuances of Chinese society? People who do not have a history of understanding China, it's confusing to know who you're talking to and what their reaction will be politically.
Very, very much so. Very much so. But at the same time, if you go into Chinese communities, you'll find that people these days, at least, are very outspoken. The people who oppose the CCP are very loudly opposed to the CCP. Mm-hmm. The people who support democracy very loudly support democracy. The house Christians, Buddhists, a lot of them oppose the CCP as well.
Mm.
So.
Well, I would imagine, thank you, Josh, I would imagine that in terms of one setting one's own political ideology or what you're for and what you're against, on one level, we've been hearing for years that we have a close relationship, we being the United States, with China being the People's Republic of China, and that they're becoming capitalist, and it's a good thing. And then in the last year or two, it's starting to become obvious that maybe it's not that good a thing. And that's something that President Trump, I think, brought to the fore. I don't remember following political discussion any candidate for president. I mean, we've had 4 presidents, 2 from each party, that basically were all of the same mind. Bring China in and let them do what they want to do. You had the 2 Bushes, you had Clinton and Obama. So this is not a left-right issue. Larry, you're on the radio. We talked about your political ideology. We made a few jokes about it. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think you're right. I think there has been a bipartisan sort of understanding permeated from this town and going into the corporate world that that doing business with China in a robust fashion is ultimately great for our economy, great for consumers in this country, certainly. I believe in free trade. I agree with, no tariffs is best, and let's get as many cheap products created without government laying on taxes on top of that, so that we can have a robust economy and we can have great big stores selling great things. And that was sort of the bargain that was made, and we convinced ourselves, and it goes back to Richard Nixon and that famous, opening up Red China back in the early 70s. We convinced ourselves that starting with economic freedom and moving inch by inch toward capitalism and free markets in China, that would then, start the dominoes falling. We did see that actually happen ultimately in the Soviet Union, but I think that the What was missing with China and what was there with the Soviet Union was that huge military threat that was hanging over Soviet Union's head, which was, our arsenal pointed at them, and they felt like militarily they had to keep up with that, and that crushed them. That hasn't been part of the equation with China, and I think you're right. I think President Trump brought this to the table and said, hold on a minute. What are we doing here? The free trade is one thing, but this is unfair. That resonated with the American people. And I think many people in this country believed that we were beholden to mainland China, that they had a lot of our debt. We had heard that narrative so much in the media that, they hold all the bonds on American debt, and so they've got us. But the fact of the matter is, if our corporations are compelled to leave China and they're not manufacturing through all of those contract manufacturers that they rely on right now for cheap goods, China is destroyed. All of that employment is so incredibly important.
So we have
to
leverage.
maintaining.
We have leverage.
Enormous leverage, and Apple and HP and every manufacturer that you can think of that is currently taking advantage of cheap, translated slave labor in mainland China, if they were compelled to move those contract manufacturing plants to the Philippines or Indonesia or any other Asia or Mexico or, God forbid, somewhere in the Dakotas or in Appalachia here in America, China would be ruined because they need that. Those are
But
job initiatives
they still
for
could
them.
count, though, on the National Basketball Association.
Well, yes, thank God.
For-
I think LeBron James might be under the control of one of these tongs that we were just learning about. That
That-
explains everything.
We make light of it, but it's ironic that the NBA story was one of the biggest eye-opening events in the news to just how influential the Chinese are over American business. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it brought it into. Listen, we've discussed it before, but what happens in popular culture really does bring a topic to the kitchen table or to the living room or to the social media stream of every American. We can talk till we're blue in the face about tariffs and about contract manufacturing and about how much your iPhone will cost if it's no longer made in China, which is part of the equation we Americans deserve to hear and part of that conversation that is sort of left out. But when the NBA has a conflict over freedom, when the NBA has a conflict with communist China, and that becomes a mainline story, suddenly it's in the consciousness of every American, and that really is a driving force in where the conversation is going now.
All right, I'm going to jump over Doug and over John and go
Story of my life.
to Dana, just so I can keep this in an order that I think makes sense in terms of this discussion. Dana Chang, you have been a wonderful source of information for me and for the readers of the Epoch Times about what's happening in Hong Kong. I want to focus on Hong Kong because it is a breaking story. And it, like so many of these stories, is murky. They just had elections. Democracy won. Beijing is angry. What's the status, as succinctly as you can do it, of the Hong Kong situation?
2 days ago, there was another protest on Human Rights Day. It's 800,000 people took to the street. It's another statement to Beijing that the Hong Kong people oppose the communist suppression. When Hong Kong was handed over to China in 1997, there was an agreement China had with UK and the US, and to keep the Hong Kong as an open society as before for 50 years. And it's exactly because of that freedom that kept international investment from leaving Hong Kong. So that international agreement is very important. But over the years, their freedom have been eroded. And ironically, Beijing promised one country, two system, not to keep Hong Kong people happy. It was because Deng Xiaoping at that time and his group and thought the openness in Hong Kong is useful for Beijing. It's more for Beijing than for Hong Kong people. So during the course of so-called reform, they send information to Hong Kong, and then the information flow back to China. They test the water and see what's the response from different levels, and they carry out change step by step. over the last 20-some years, they have been sending mainland people to China to dilute the opinion and the popularity there, and so gradually influence Hong Kong and control different parts of Hong Kong. However, the people going there start to make their own use. So the information there become a threat to Beijing. So Beijing want a better control of Hong Kong. Their method to control Hong Kong, for Hong Kong people, they cannot accept. They think this is a last opportunity to defend the freedom. And that's why people all stepped forward and took to the street.
What I would like to determine in my question of you, because you've gone back and given us the background on it all, let's talk about not the last 20 years, let's talk about the last 3 weeks.
Yes.
As clearly, and again, I want to push people forward to
Yeah.
keep this moving. Is the situation getting more dangerous? Is it going to ease up for a while in terms of it being, a fuse, a tinderbox, something that could explode into trouble? What is your view on that?
I think with international support, it'll be easier for Hong Kong people.
Easier, okay.
Yes.
Dr. Gorka, you were an advisor to the president. Right now you are an advisor to your listeners on one of the biggest platforms in the radio industry. If Donald Trump were sitting across the table from you and he said, Seb, what do you think I should do? And again, it's succinct. What do you think I should do in terms of China? What would you tell him?
Well, first things first, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to Talkers, thank you to Epoch Times. It's great to see friends here like John and Larry on the podium. I want to start by saying what Epoch Times is doing is monumentally important, and I'm very grateful that there are some real journalists left, like Jan Jakielek and everybody else at Epoch Times. With regards to the president, I don't have advice to give the president because he's doing exactly what he needs to do. Watch the interviews he gave in the 1980s about China. This man knew the problem 40 years ago. He knows that what Nixon and Kissinger did was the biggest geopolitical mistake in modern American history. We facilitated a nation that was not even a developing nation to become a peer competitor. When we arrived in the White House, if you use purchasing parity, not nominal GDP, China's GDP was in fact larger than ours. Larger than ours. They have a very simple strategy, one belt, one road, to displace America and to become the most powerful hegemon in the world. China has always, since the ending of the period of the warring states, China has always been an empire. Now it's just a communist empire. By 2049, by the 100th anniversary of the revolution, they wish to become the global hegemon. They wish to have only two types of nations in the world. Competitors they will destroy, and satrapies, tributary nations. That is the Chinese plan. Donald Trump has known this for two generations, and when he came into the White House, we gave him the classified information to prove to him what China is doing inside America to destroy this great nation, the greatest nation. He's doing exactly what he needs to do. China remains the most oppressive, large-scale, powerful nation in the world today. As a child of people who escaped a communist dictatorship, my father escaped a communist prison in the 1956 revolution. This is especially important to me that we understand what is going on right now. With regards to the only thing I'd say to the president, the primary difficulty, China is in trouble. China needs to maintain double-digit growth rates for the next 30 years. The only thing that China is scared of is internal collapse. That is their biggest threat. And when you have the biggest Mercedes-Benz dealer in the world in China, at the same time that there are millions of people who don't have a pair of shoes, sooner or later that can turn to internal violence. What we're seeing in Xinjiang and elsewhere tells you how worried the Politburo is. The only fly in the ointment to the current Trump administration's policy is they're being squeezed, they feel the pressure, that's why they haven't rolled the tanks into Hong Kong. But Xi Jinping still thinks he can play Donald Trump. Xi Jinping still thinks he can get the better of an individual he deems to be a Caucasian rube. And he's wrong. This is not a man to be messed with. He will not be trifled. And it is because of his policies right now, when the president tweeted this out a few days ago, who's absolutely right. Thousands of lives are being saved every day in Hong Kong because Donald Trump is president and not somebody from the swamp like Hillary or Biden who would acquiesce to the communist dictatorship in Beijing. So he needs to keep doing what he's doing. And God willing, sooner or later, God willing, if the president is reelected, Xi Jinping will finally realize that Donald J. Trump is not a president to be trifled with or to be tested.
Thank you for that. Very interesting indeed. Doug Steffen, you're a farmer. I want to, just for the record, Doug does a national show on the weekend that's on almost 300 radio stations called The American Family Farmer, in addition to doing his daily generalist and political show that's on hundreds of stations. And The American Family Farmer actually was born out of a conversation that you and I had.
Correct.
When Doug was talking about how difficult it is for farmers today to deal not only with China, but to deal with other farmers. The American, just a momentary background, the American family farmer is under siege by the corporate big ag farmers. So I want to set that up in advance, that Doug is a spokesperson for the small farmer in their battle against major agriculture corporately, and that's a whole other issue, and he's a champion of the small farmers, and that's a bit of his background. But I would love for you to step up to the plate now and talk about both the small and the big farmers, and because we hear the farmers are an area that it seems are resistant to the Trump approach, and that they're the ones being hurt most economically by the trade tariffs. So enlighten us.
Let me talk about the fate of the farmer first before we talk about Trump and what he is doing and isn't doing in terms of, imagine this guy who has the personality that he does, and that creates froth, and then dealing with problems that are intelligently being dealt with, I think, in terms of China and the trade policies that we have, the NAFTA thing that's being signed this week. All those were really problems for the American family farmer especially, and for a number of years the farmer has been ignored. I'm talking about big time ignorance on the part of people, because there's so much separation now. It used to be, even when I was a kid, there were a lot of people in my neighborhood who had cows, they had chickens, they were able to create their own source of food. They had gardens. That isn't the case today. More and more people are moving into suburbs and urban areas, and there is not, unless you go to New York or Washington and see somebody growing a garden on the roof of the building here, that's about all you're going to get in terms of agriculture. So, and I don't presuppose to think that Donald Trump is an expert in agriculture. He's a New Yorker and he likes hamburgers. So that doesn't necessarily disqualify him, but I don't think his eye is on that ball particularly. I think what's going on, though, in terms of China, I know what's going on in terms of China. They have been, in very specific ways, buying up means of production and distribution of food. They started with Smithfield, the largest pork producer in America. They bought them 3 years ago. So now the Chinese control all the major pork industries in this country. 1. 2, they're about to buy Bumblebee brand that just went belly up about 10 days ago. That not only is a tuna, but they also have canned sources or resources of chicken and crab and all kinds of other things. And they have just now started to have liaison conversations between farmers that are growing for Tyson and for Purdue. The other big chicken producers are all being courted by Chinese industry and Chinese influence to grow birds for China. They have a problem. They have an agricultural problem. They got plenty of problems, but agriculture and feeding their people as Michael said a few minutes ago, it's the largest population on the planet, and they don't have a commercial farm agriculture structure the way we do. So they're buying a lot of things from us, and when the trade war started, it did impact especially the large commercial growers, but it also has affected family farmers that may have out in Iowa 6,000 to 8,000 acres of corn and beans, and they got no place to sell it because there's no market. The other thing that I think is part of this that ought not to be overlooked is the influence that through this kind of hubbub, and then through working what their magic may be in trying to get into inculcating their way into our lives, they're trying to influence. I thought it was interesting what Dr. Gorka and what Michael said about this, put the trade deal off for a while. It's to the Chinese interest to disturb or make the farmers upset so that, you'll recall last time, Trump got the farm vote. This time, there are questions because of the trade war and what people don't understand, and the Chinese want to disrupt Trump's influence in the farm community, and if they could screw with the trade bill, that's the way they can do it because they don't want Trump to win. So I can go in any number of directions from there.
Yeah, well,
Michael,
we'll save that because we'll get into the Trump paradox, which is that Trump certainly has served up a lot of red meat for the people that don't like him for visceral reasons, his personality, his policies in some areas, et cetera. But on the other level, a case could be made that he's been one of the most effective presidents in the history of the country, and that when it comes to serious issues such as China, as evidenced by the fact that we've had bipartisan support of just the opposite of what perhaps we should be doing, that alone might be a reason to keep him. So it's sort of a paradox in a polarized country where everything is black or white, left or right, Democrat or Republican, you're a Trump lover or you're a Trump hater. This president has not really been given a fair, even-handed, up and down, to the left, to the right assessment by the media and by the public. So I call that the Trump paradox because it makes it very difficult to go forward. We've become one-issue people, and that's it. I see that John is smiling. John, you're the only one we haven't heard from yet. You do a show. You're a conservative. You are pro-Trump. That is obvious. But one of the things that I've noticed listening to you is that you do have an open mind to putting lots of ideas on the table. You don't only focus your show to be in accordance with your personal point of view. You're very tolerant that way. And being an independent talk entrepreneur, you've got a good pulse on the public. How do you deal with, or what do you think we should do to deal with this syndrome I described as the Trump paradox?
Well, first of all, Michael, thanks for having me. I want to thank Dana for being here, also from the Epoch Times, who's been on my show many times. I want to thank the Epoch Times for the great work you guys do in trying to bring this to the forefront. A couple of things I want to say. You heard Seb Gorka earlier talk about this swamp and good thing Trump is president and not Biden or Clinton. But let me say, good thing Trump is president and not George Bush, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Mitt Romney. I mean, the beat goes on. This is not a Republican-Democrat thing. We heard for 5 panelists come up here so far and tell you what a threat China is. And yet, if you listen to the fake news, it's Trump's fault because of what they call the trade war that Trump has created, so farmers in Iowa can't sell soybeans someplace, or your can of Pabst Blue Ribbon is going to go up by 3 cents, and that's going to be the end of your world. Now, I'm not ashamed to say that I'm an economic protectionist because this country was founded on industrial protectionism in the 1800s. We have to protect our jobs. The unholy alliance of all time is right here in Washington, D.C. and New York, and it is between the Chinese Communist government and Goldman Sachs, Wall Street, Dow Jones, and the cheap labor slave trade network that has been colluding with each other to take our jobs out and destroy our supply chain, feeding in to the narrative that you just heard from our 5 panelists. And we're not doing a damn thing about it until Trump came along. And now, every day, you've got the fake news media coming out and blaming some coming economic catastrophe on the president's trade policies. Here's what the president is attempting to do that nobody understands. This isn't about raising money through tariffs. It's about one thing, and that's bringing the supply chain back from China to the United States. When you bring the supply chain back, you cut off their long-term control. When you bring our supply chain back, you create good-paying American jobs. When you bring the supply chain back, we gain back control of our geo-economic global destiny. We were going down a path where we couldn't manufacture steel. This country was built on steel. We couldn't produce aluminum. Why? Because the Chinese government would subsidize it, cheap labor, dump it in the United States. There weren't any tariffs. What happened? We didn't have a steel industry. We didn't have an aluminum industry. And every time somebody complained about it, Goldman Sachs, Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones, Republicans, the whole bunch of them said, oh my God, if you do a tariff, it's like a tax. You're going to hurt the consumer. Your Pabst Blue Ribbon beer is going to go up by 5 cents. You'll pay another 27 cents for your iPhone 15 or whatever garbage they spew out on a daily basis. And so they have completely put this over our eyes. And now everybody says, well, we can't have tariffs because that's a tax. We've had these tariffs. Inflation is zero. Why? Because the Chinese government just continues to increase their subsidies in order to keep dumping the products in the United States. But there's no media that is telling this story. Every time Trump had a new tariff out, I would be on the radio, just like you said, 8:45 a.m., right? Every time a new tariff came out, within 3 minutes, not 5, there was an immediate Wall Street Journal editorial pushed out about this brand new tariff and how it was going to cause economic Armageddon for every consumer. The editorials were pre-written. They couldn't wait to hit the button. This had nothing to do with analysis. Who are these people paid by? They're paid by Goldman Sachs, Wall Street Journal, so they can make more money at the expense and on the backs of U.S. workers. And do you know who stopped it? Trump. Do you know who has exposed the ruse? Trump. Do you know who's standing firm? Trump. Now, Trump holds all the cards now. This is why the Chinese are so desperate. Trump holds all the cards. Our economy is roaring. The tariffs had no impact on anything. Chinese unemployment is up. Chinese economic activity is down. They desperately need to put their people to work, even if it's 5 cents an hour and a rice ball. They need to put them at work. So now it's all going away. Planets are pulling out, and Trump holds all the cards. That's why if he can't get the negotiation that is preferable to the United States, he's simply going to walk away.
Did you want to add something, Doug?
Well, I think it's not quite true that the tariffs hadn't had any effect on anybody. They've had a dramatic effect on farms and farming and our sources of food, where they're coming from. I think that there's a danger not only in the Chinese light, but also one of the good things about the trade agreement, the NAFTA rework, and what's going on in Europe with the trade policies being changed there, is that we'll have a little bit more reasonable approaches to handling food that comes from these places. But the farmer is very much being hurt.
Okay,
The problem is that the subsidies that were announced by Trump aren't going to the farmers.
Your
and that's a
point is
problem.
taken. I want to move on to, gentlemen, have your discussion afterwards. Please, Doug.
We got a break for traffic and weather, gentlemen, please.
That's funny. I just want to say, I find it interesting following the last 20 years, 25 years, and I address this to the audience and to the panel, that We talk about how it's becoming a global community and it's a global economy and it's a global world, and that we in the United States hold certain principles about human dignity very dear, that we should pay a minimum amount of money and wage, and we're against slavery. And yet economics really is the boundary, is the border of what a real nation is. So on one level, we're global in that aspect of our economy, but it's okay that people that are part of that economy are making a nickel an hour and basically slaves. We have a lot of soul searching. I see in John's face some recognition to what I'm saying. Would you agree with that? That there's an ethical issue here in terms of saving a buck on your sneakers or whatever it is? And if and Larry...
Well, yeah, and actually, if I could also say, with regard to our immigration policies and our immigrant community, we often hear, we see people coming across our southern border, and the vast majority of them are coming from Latin America, and they're even claiming humanitarian status or refugee status and asking for refugee asylum because of economic conditions, which is not a legitimate reason for asylum status in this country. That's not persecution because your home country is a basket case economically and doesn't have jobs. But let's face it, they are coming here. We keep hearing they're coming to America for a better life, and that always means jobs and money. When you look at the immigration that we get from Asia, when you look at Chinese people who are coming to this country, and when they come to America and they want a better life, it has very little to do with a job and with money. It has to do with freedom. It has to do with liberty. It has to do with freedom of expression. It has to do with the things that this country really was founded on, and the things that used to be the reason why immigrants from all around the world would want to come to America. Now, sadly, so many people who come to this country, whether legally or illegally, are coming because they see America as a giant ATM. And politically, the political conversation in America with regard to immigration has almost entirely centered around that. We have a booming economy. It's not fair to the rest of the world that we have so much wealth and other countries are coming from poverty-stricken nations. So we are compelled to open up our gates and our borders to allow people in for money. And it's actually, frankly, the most shallow reason that we should modify our immigration policies. And so, we shouldn't have a one-size-fits-all immigration policy around the country, because I have such admiration for people, especially from a dictatorship like China, who truly do want to come here for everything that America stands for beyond our economy.
Right.
And that's critically important.
Moving this on beyond that, but I do believe that if we have any kind of war, whether it's a trade war or a military war or a basketball war, Americans, it troubles me, seem very complacent about that as being somebody else's issue, whereas if you know history, which I gather is not as big a deal today as it was when we were growing up, war means sacrifice. If you're going to be for any kind of a war, you have to understand as a citizen there's sacrifice, and that means if you have to pay more for goods or you have to do without certain things or whatever it is, war is, each person is a signatory to that contract, that it's not just somebody else. You could be opposed to it, but it amazes me how many people are for war but don't want to put anything into it. Let's switch. We can go forever on the trade aspect of it, but there's human rights abuses, there's surveillance issues, there's North Korea, there's intellectual property, there's the long-term goals and psychology of the Communist Chinese. So I want to go to Josh. And Josh, just again, because we could talk for hours on this, so I don't mean to disrespect anybody by saying keep it brief, especially in your end, because you are one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met when it comes to the real nitty-gritty of the war between the United States and China. That if anybody has an insight to why this is, we use the word frenemy. It's more on the enemy side than the friend side. Fill us in on the latest in this surveillance war and Huawei and 5G.
All right, so a couple points here that I think we'll start from kind of the broader perspective. The Chinese Communist Party is waging a full-scale war on the United States, being fought in ways that we traditionally do not identify as warfare. They call this, it's been called unrestricted warfare. Some people call it short of war tactics. Some people call it hybrid warfare, asymmetrical hybrid warfare, all kinds of names for it. Basically, what it is the Chinese Communist Party looked at the playing field and said the United States is the main force preventing us from becoming the global hegemon. And so how do you wage a war on a country without engaging in troop-on-troop combat? What would you want to achieve in a war with another country? And so what they did is they looked at they're a communist society, they control every single part of the society. And they said, how can we weaponize every single piece of our society against the United States? And so there is agricultural warfare, there's resource warfare, there's business warfare, there's cyber warfare, there's ideological warfare, psychological warfare, there's media warfare, there's drug warfare, smuggling warfare. And
the word warfare should be taken seriously because there is a fine line between warfare and healthy competition. And
I should note too that these terms are terms they themselves use. And so what is the goal of a communist system? It's to gain dominance over a society, essentially, absolute dominance. And there are 3 tiers of dominance. There's psychological dominance, there's physical dominance, and there's spiritual dominance. The Chinese Communist Party has created its own versions of religions. It has state-run religions. And any religion that does not align with that is crushed. Its people are thrown in concentration camps, their organs are harvested, they are tortured. We see this right now with the Uyghurs very prominently. When it comes to psychological warfare, they have the 3 warfares doctrine, adopted into their military code. Psychological warfare, to alter the way you interpret information, not necessarily twisting the information itself, but changing the narrative of how you view things. Media warfare to control outlets of information, and legal warfare to manipulate international legal standards in their interest. And when we get into the physical element, that's when we get into agricultural warfare, right? Who controls the means of production? You can use the One Belt, One Road. You can use Huawei to go into other countries. You can get them into debt traps, and you can dominate their society. You gain control of their core GDP products. You gain control of the things that make that country work. You gain control of their natural resources, their major corporations, their food, their businesses, their factories. Who controls that society? And then if you put on top of it the United Front, as I mentioned before, then you're talking about political corruption, bribes, gangs, mafia, not even just the surface level. You're getting into drug warfare, who controls the underbellies of that society, who controls the strong arms of that society. They are working on every single one of these branches, and it is a full-scale war that goes to the very edge of what we would consider war, but does not cross it.
Thank you for that. Very well done. Dr. Gorka, do you believe that Josh Phillips overstated this? Or do you believe that because those are words we don't often hear in the media, very, very serious accusations. And what is your take on the Huawei 5G surveillance issue?
Utter total data dominance in the globe. It's very simple. It's what Huawei is about, to control every aspect of data transmittal in the world. No more, no less. I would say the opposite is perhaps an understatement of the threat. Just read Unrestricted Warfare. Just read the books they are using to train their PLA officers. If you read their strategies, they are very clear. There is no dichotomy between war and peace. That is a feeble Western concept. War is continual. War by all means, political, economic, cultural. The fact that we have cultural centers across America that are actually undermining our cultural values and are partnered with American universities. The fact, just don't take my word for it. At the beginning of the administration, we succeeded in having the DOJ declassify a case that had been brought to trial in the United States. In a Midwest cornfield, just by chance, a Chinese operative was arrested. Doing what in a cornfield? Digging up and stealing the latest version of GMO blight-resistant corn that had been developed at the cost of millions, if not billions of dollars. To do what? To smuggle it back to China and to reverse engineer that product. That's a Chinese agent on US soil attacking our farm industry. This isn't a theory. It is happening right now. If you look at what China is paying for in terms of advertising in our lead media organs, if you look at who's funding various political activities, look at what's happening in Australia. If you want to see how bad it can get, it's all declassified. Australian members of parliament, politicians, literally being bought by Chinese interests. And then we have somebody who's running for president right now, who's actually the lead potential nominee for the Democrat Party, who travels to China on Air Force Two with his son, and 10 days later, his son, Hunter Biden, is given a $1.4 billion deal with the National Bank of Communist China. What more evidence do you need? If there's any threat to America, it's the embedded nature of the swamp and the political elite with Chinese interests for absolute decades. And I'll end on this. That's why an hour ago, articles of impeachment were dropped in the Congress. That's really the reason why an hour ago the Democrat Party brought 2 articles of impeachment. Because my old boss, Donald Trump, is not owned by the swamp. He is a legitimate, lethal threat to the vested interests that have been in bed with China in this city and the West Coast. Remember, Google is up to their eyeballs assisting the communist regime in censoring information in front of their own population. When we elected, 63 million people elected a man who had never held public office before, we sent a very clear message. The swamp has betrayed America for at least since the Nixon administration. You look on left and right, read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. We exported the jobs to China and we imported the fentanyl. 72,000 people died last year in America because of drug overdoses. That's 20,000 more than in 10 years of the Vietnam War. In 1 year.
Dr. Gorka, what do you see as the end game?
For who?
For this battle with China? How?
They've said it. It's very clear what the end game is.
What is it?
They will be, by 2049, by the 100th anniversary of the Communist Revolution, the sole hegemonic global
No.
force.
I mean our end game.
What's our end game?
Yeah. How do we prevent that from happening, taken to its fullest logical extent?
I'm a little bit leery of saying it because I know they'll be watching this video in Beijing, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's only one thing that Emperor Xi is afraid of. There's only one thing the Communist Party is afraid of: internal collapse. And if America is wise, we will use that against them.
When you say internal collapse, do you mean economic collapse or do you mean total regime change?
I mean, very simply, the inability of the regime to control its population. From Sun Tzu on down, the primary threat, as Chinese strategic culture has deemed it, is not invasion. The primary threat since the era of the Warring States is that China does not remain a unitary nation. That is why you are seeing what you are seeing in Xinjiang province. That is why you are seeing, the organ harvesting of political prisoners. China is petrified that they cannot maintain internal cohesion, and that internal cohesion, as I said previously, requires double-digit growth rates in the Chinese economy for at least 30 years. And we can stop that from happening. We can make it impossible for that economic growth to occur so the regime stays in power. This administration is not some kind of dastardly neoconservative regime changing, Bill Kristol lunacy. This president is not a neocon. He's not an interventionist, but he's a patriot, and he will do everything it takes to put American interests first, whether it's steel workers in Youngstown, Ohio, whether it's opioid victims, and China is on his list of primary threats. It's the only strategic threat we face. We'll deal with Russia, we'll deal with Iran, we'll deal with all of those other threats. China, it's the biggest thing we achieved in the White House in the first 7 months of our tenure, is we convinced the president, read the national security strategy, America only faces one strategic level peer competitor, and it is communist China.
Doug, you have a comment?
Well, I'm wondering to throw it back to Dr. Gorka, or maybe all of us, what are we doing? We're talking about what they're doing to get a hold of, as much as they can, of our thought process, of where we get our food, of where we get our work, all of that stuff. So can the president, through executive order, stop, for example, all the orders for Chinese trains? Every single major city in this country is buying their new trolleys and trains from the Chinese. And the same is true with buses. The Chinese, we're talking about the inner workings of the cities, the Chinese are paying for the bus companies they're making the buses, they're paying for the buses to carry people from one city to another. So what are we doing, or what do we need to do to stop that?
A lot of this is communicative. A lot of this is, this is why any conservative who says they're a conservative comes to me and complains about the president's Twitter feed. I'd tell them, go to hell. His Twitter feed is why he got elected, and his Twitter feed is why Xi Jinping is worried. It's very, very important to understand the power of those tweets. What are we doing? I'm a conservative. I grew up under Maggie Thatcher. For me, Ronald Reagan is a hero. I don't want federal government to solve this. I don't look at Uncle Sam to fix these problems, because that's a Democrat approach. This is fundamentally, on the long term, an educative objective. This is why Epoch Times, this is why talk radio, what Larry, what John do is so important. Why? We have to break this suicidal culture in America, where Google won't work with the Pentagon, but they'll work with the Communist government of China. We have to stop this idea that, local train companies are buying stock because it's cheap now and it's going to fall apart in 5 years' time. The idea, what a wonderful large market China is. Let's invest there. When look what happened to Vodafone. You go there, you invest, and they will burn you to the ground. They will steal all your IP within 24 months and then push you out of the market. The idea that you want short-term profit and you forget the national interests of your nation and your company, which will eventually go down to a Chinese competitor. We have to educate Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, the Beltway bandits, the American people. The president got this because he was in the building industry. He understood it a long, long time ago. When you sign a steel deal with a steel producer in China, do you know what happens? My brother-in-law owned one of the biggest steel companies in America. You go there, you send your inspectors, you check the quality of the steel, it's great, they ship it. Within 6 months, they are sending you dross. They are sending you garbage steel. Why? Because they think you're white, they think you're uncouth, and they can have a fast one over you. And they think they can take you down because they are the superior civilization. They had mandarins when we were still running around in furs, okay? When we were barbarians. That's the attitude. So what do we have to do? You, me, everyone here, the Epoch Times, has to educate the American people and understand this is a war, and it is happening right now as we sit here.
Thank you.
What Doug's saying, though, if I can jump in, is if it's war, there's certainly a role for the federal government to defend this nation, provide for the common defense and all that, if it's really war. If we use that rhetoric and say that this is not just a trade war, but it's an intellectual war and a psychological war and actually a physical war, is there a role for the federal government to actually proactively not only defend us, but actually hit back?
That's a rhetorical question that I think is extremely interesting at this point in time, because I don't think when I think when the framers talked about war, they really were thinking about military war.
But Michael, they control
not saying
Huawei, and the means of the information getting to us. They control. They watch our every move. They're putting these devices in these trolleys, the trains and stuff. They could pull the plug and stop all of that stuff at a moment's notice.
The loss of privacy is one of the biggest situations that is a threat to our freedom here in December of 2019. The loss of privacy, and I don't see how we can get the toothpaste back in that tube at this point, as we're rewiring the human nervous system to be plugged into each other's heads. And the average American citizen has to worry about losing their privacy and everything about their lives to American companies that are not necessarily of the highest concern of what the framers meant and what is war, let alone the Chinese. John?
Like Seb said, it's really about educating the American public so they know what's going on. To Doug's point, and we have brought this up for years, is the fact that U.S. train manufacturers can't sell a train car in the United States. Why? Because they're manufactured in China at cheap labor under the cost of production, which is then subsidized, shipped in to the port of LA with no tariffs. So if you are a city buying trains, I'm sorry, your job is to get the best deal, right? And the company, whether it's Norfolk Southern, is to get the best deal. That's what you're paid to do. So you're going to buy them from China because the U.S. manufacturer has been priced out of the market, not because they're better, smarter, sleeker, is because they employ slave labor and then the government subsidizes it to take over the industry. So the only answer to that is you have to put a tariff on the train cars and the buses coming in to San Diego and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and that tariff has to be so high that it can make the U.S. manufacturer competitive. Once you do that, the train manufacturers pop back up. Now, here's where the education comes in. Your fare goes up 5 cents. Right. And everybody's pissed. Oh my God, I got a fare increase. I got to pay another 7 cents to get 8 blocks. Until you educate the American people that the 7 cents you're paying is to save your country, Americans are smart. They'll figure it out. That's why they voted for Trump in 2016. They had enough. They will figure it out. I'll pay the 7 cents. I'll pay the 8 cents. I'll pay the extra $200 for my car. When Chrysler put their plants, their Cadillac plant in China, right? Some of the cars were made in China. Some of them were made in the U.S. When you went to the dealership, the prices were the same. China, car made there. U.S. car made there. There was no sign on your sticker that said, well, this car's made in China. You're going to pay $2,000 under. You paid the same. Everybody was reaping the benefit and screwing our economy because nobody understood it. Now, as Seb says, and Doug here says, it's education. If we tell Americans what is going on and the cost that they're going to have to bear in order to get our supply chain back, that's the answer, I believe.
This goes back to what I said earlier about sacrifice. We have successfully presented an overview of this particular aspect of the complexity of the relationship between the United States and China. Let's move on to something that we did not really touch on at the first discussion. So I'm going to move to something, as Monty Python would say, completely different. And we have 2 people on the panel who are very, very plugged into this. Let's talk about human rights abuses. And I would like to touch upon, for the sake of education and righting a wrong that I believe was caused by the communist Chinese manipulation of American sensibilities and media, Falun Gong particularly. Falun Gong has been presented to the American public. Most people don't know what that is at all, but if people live in New York or Washington where there are communities of people practicing this, they have an insight to it, but they may not fully understand that this is a religion, and it has been suppressed viciously by the communists and subject to misinterpretation by an unaware American public. Nansu and Dr. Chang, it's a tough assignment, but try to explain. We'll start with whichever one wants to go first. Do you want to go first, Dr. Chang, or should Nan? Okay, Dr. Chang, what is Falun Gong and what has happened to Falun Gong as best you can do it?
Falun Gong is a traditional meditation system. We call it cultivation. It teaches 5 sets of exercises, very gentle and very helpful to improve health. And it teaches the principle of being truthful, compassionate, and tolerant. From 92 to 99, in 7 years, it got very popular in China. And so if one person practices, the whole family start to join because it's very effective in improving health. And it has a high standard for improved moral standard. So in 98, the Chinese government started to investigate why it's so popular. And the result is it actually saved a lot of money in medical bill for the government. So the premier was very happy. But at the same time, they found out that the member of Falun Gong practitioners actually outnumbered the Communist Party member. And especially many high-level communist officials practice Falun Gong. And so Jiang Zemin, that's the chairman of the Communist Party at that time, was very scared because he was not elected. He came to power after Tiananmen Square crackdown, and he was very afraid. So he ordered the persecution. And even other high-level Communist Party members did not agree because their family members practice. The persecution affected almost everyone because it was 100 million people practicing. Every Chinese know a family member, relative, or friend that is practicing Falun Gong. A lot of things happened later on in the past 2 decades in terms of like human right abuse or censorship actually originated in persecution of Falun Gong. For example, the labor camp in Xinjiang right now, originally it was built to lock up Falun Gong practitioners. There were so many members, and they set up a lot of labor camp, and the prisons have to release real criminals and leave the space for Falun Gong practitioners. They start to build labor camp in Xinjiang. And because outside China, like our media, we start to expose the human rights abuse and the persecution. They were very scared. They start to build internet censorship, and it becomes, stronger and stronger to block Chinese people from knowing what's going on, especially the persecution of Falun Gong. A lot of human rights abuse, including the organ harvesting, started from harvesting the organ from Falun Gong, and it's because they too know that Falun Gong practitioners are very healthy. They lock them up and put their data on a live bank. Anyone who go there can book an organ transplant within a week or 2. This, without any investigation, you can know that's live people waiting there for the organ, because it's not impossible you can predict a death that would match your organ 2 weeks in advance.
Is this information suppressed completely, from the Chinese people living in mainland China?
Of course, if you talk to any of the people, most of the people, I would say, from China, they don't know about it. And they shocked, and then they say, oh, this never happened.
They think it's fake news.
Right. Well, of course. Now, I want to add something to Dr. Chang. I think that the Falun Gong was persecuted. Only reason was really the Chinese government want to dictate the standard to measure what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad in China. So Falun Gong have their own moral standard of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. So Falun Gong was persecuted for the same reason the Christianity was persecuted in China, and any other people have a faith being persecuted. Now, if you think about the current leader circle of China, the Xi Jinping and all the top leaders, they are at the age about 60 to 70. So if you go back to look their life, during the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 76, they are about the age of teenagers and elementary school students. This is the generation who grew up with the entire tradition and faith being wiped out. So they grew up without any faith. And now they used to believe communism. Now, in the 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, they don't even believe communism anymore. So you end up in the situation, well, if they believe communism, although it's a bad thing, but at least we can predict based on what they believe, how they're going to react. But now they just believe themselves. So how are you going to deal with a regime that doesn't have anything they believe? So that's the issue. That's regardless, it's trade war or it's. You look at the trade negotiation; they are acting the same way with how North Korea dealing with nuclear issues, because they promise today, they change tomorrow. Same thing on all the trade negotiations. They promise something, they change tomorrow. So the most challenging part of the trade negotiation, it's not about the intellectual property, about all this forced technology transfer. It's how you're going to secure what they are going to do, what they promised. That's the center issue, because they have no standard.
Thank you very much for that information. And let's now, each person on the panel, take about a minute, because we only have about 8 minutes left, to sum up and what they thought or something that they wanted to say. But please keep it to within about 60 seconds. Nan, we'll start with you. What did we miss? What do you want to say? Anything?
For me?
Yes.
Okay. I will say this. We have the perfect combination here in the United States to take down the communist regime, because here we have people who truly believe the traditional wisdom from 5,000 years of Chinese culture. We are dealing with a regime with a bad idea. That's from Karl Marx, from Germany. Think about how many times Americans have beat bad stuff from Germany and Russia. We did it in World War I, World War II, and we did it in Cold War. So we have the encouragement of the freedom-loving people in the American, plus the wisdom from 5,000 years of Chinese culture. This is a perfect combination to take down the regime.
Thank you. Josh.
Yeah. So I, of course, painted a pretty serious picture in terms of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing with warfare. But I would say that they are a paper tiger when it comes to ideology. They are, like Dr. Gorka said, they are terrified of internal instability. And at the same time, the Chinese people no longer fear the Chinese Communist Party. There are two types of order, essentially, right? There's order from above, order from government, and there's order from the internal moral standards. The Chinese Communist Party wiped out the moral standards. And so the only order in China is from the laws and persecutions of the Chinese Communist Party. That is only effective if people fear the Chinese Communist Party, and they are losing control on that ground. And I think Hong Kong is a perfect example of this. People, even in relatively free Hong Kong, are willing to risk death in order to not live under the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party. And in mainland China, the only interest people have left is the idea that, well, economic interest, business interest, my pension, maybe I'll have a better life if I don't stand against the regime.
Let me jump in and ask you a question, otherwise it'll bug me when I watch the video of this. They no longer fear the Communist Party. That's a powerful statement, because earlier you had said that people living in this country are afraid to speak out against China because they're afraid of the Communist Party has tentacles that reach into our communities. Just define what you mean by fear. They're less fearful than they might have been 10 years ago, because I find it hard to say they don't fear, because that invalidates, if the Chinese people don't fear the Communist Party, to one level or another, I don't mean to discredit what you're saying, but just to clarify it.
Well,
if they don't fear it to one degree or another, then why are we having this discussion?
I should clear that they do fear it. They are aware of the danger it poses to them, but to them, death is better than living under the Communist Party's heel. They are willing to face the fear that they observe, because they would rather have that than to live under the Chinese Communist Party. I think the Hong Kong protesters are afraid, but the potential cost of what they're doing to them is worth it.
Got it. Understand. Larry?
Well, I'd love to just sort of spin off of that for a moment, because those protesters in Hong Kong, of course, famously, we were all moved by the fact that by the hundreds of thousands, they're marching carrying the American flag. singing our national anthem in solidarity with our country and our ideals. And that's not about trade. That's not about the economic power of our nation. It's about what our country stands for. In Tiananmen Square, they made a facsimile of the Statue of Liberty. Now, sadly, in the last administration, and frankly, many of the administrations, Republican and Democrat, in this country, we'd sort of lost sight of that. And we bought into the idea that globally our nation was really just a big market, and it was all about what our spending power was and what our manufacturing power was. But the rest of the world, they still see us as something. They still see us as a bastion of freedom and liberty and ideas. And people who are willing to die a free man versus living as a slave, I mean, that's what our nation was founded on, and it goes all the way back to the Hebrews dying on the hillside of Masada. It's something that we must stand for and must lead the world in. And I think it's important, just to wrap it up, as you see the Democratic Party debate right now about who will be their nominee, you don't hear China in the conversation much, do you? You don't hear trade issues really in the conversation much. 4 years ago, they talked about NAFTA. They talked about the trade agreement with the Pacific Rim. That was a major deal. President Trump has been able to neutralize that from the Democratic Party, which is, again, an opportunity. Okay, we're not debating trade anymore. We sort of do have a path that it seems most Americans are solid with and following the president's lead on. So now let's talk about all those other things that really does make America great, not just here, but around the world. And we can make a difference in China. That should be the top priority.
Thank you, Larry. Doug.
Amen to that. I think that there are some things we all have our interests, we all have our areas of specialty. Going back to the agricultural issues that are before us as a country and the Chinese infiltration into the means of production, it isn't just the Chinese, it's people from South America who are trying to send food here that we're not inspecting. We're not doing a job that ought to be done, and I'm sad to say that I think that one of the weakest links in this administration is the Agriculture Department and the guy who leads it. And so what we need to do is I would like to think that we could get beyond the politics of Trump bad, my idea is good. I mean, that's not practical, nor is it right. But when it comes down to what we eat, what you put in your mouth, how you nourish yourself, there's a reason, and one of the reasons that our lifespan has now started to diminish and go the other way is because we're eating a lot of crap. And a lot of the crap that we're eating is coming from Chinese, either being produced actually, in fact, in China or under Chinese influence. One of the things that we need to do is pay more attention to the sources of our food and to get a handle on, if you will, back to the controlling of where the food grows and how it is processed. And the Chinese have much more to say about that or do with it than most of us realize.
Thank you, Doug. All right, John.
Well, this conflict with China is tough for Americans to grasp because there was always an ideological enemy we've had. So we were fighting colonialism or feudalism or fascism or communism or jihadist. China's not about that now. Their Communist Party has one goal in mind, and that's power and money. And so it's very difficult for Americans to grasp this. Much easier when we were fighting the Soviet communist expansionism, right? Or fascism, or during World War I, territorialism. People understood that. This is very difficult to understand. And your engagement in this war is basically education and understanding you're going to have to pay a few dollars for something. And if you really want to trace this back to what the problem is, and I hate to say this with so many of my Republican friends here, but was George W. Bush that really planted the seed that we can go to war, cut taxes, increase benefits, and everything would be fine and somebody else would fight it. That's basically the same mantra we're in right now. This regime is about power and money and control, and it's not ideological. And so it's tougher for Americans to grasp. That's where the education comes in. Thank you.
That's been the purpose of this panel. Thank you. Okay, we're going to wrap it up with Dr. Chang and Dr. Gorka. Dr. Chang, briefly, please.
The trade war or the conflict between U.S. and China is not about two countries. It's about the free world versus the communist regime. Actually, the Communist Party has crisis from every direction. Besides Hong Kong protest and trade war with U.S., its economic slowdown, its political systems in fight, and we probably don't know that how many protests are there inside China. Actually, a few years ago there was a report released. A whole year there are more than 100,000 protests. That's average like 200-300 protests a day. Now it's more, but there's no more report anymore.
Don't they call protests in their language, if it's more than a certain number of people, riots?
Right.
That they dramatize it as riots.
Right.
Dr. Gorka, wrap us up.
Two very short conclusions, a message to Xi Jinping and a message to my fellow Americans. The Communist Party in China needs to understand something very clearly. We know what you're afraid of, and Donald Trump knows how to leverage it. For the American people, we know the story. There's a famous, everybody here in this room knows this individual's name, I would hope, Chen Guangcheng. He is the barefoot lawyer, the blind lawyer, pro-life activist who risked his life to stop the one-child policy in China that led to the deaths of literally millions, if not tens of millions of young girls. When Guangcheng was under house arrest, surveilled by the secret police, he managed to escape house arrest by climbing as a completely blind man onto the roof of his house, climbing across various buildings, and then hitchhiking his way to Beijing. When this blind man, this brave blind man, arrived in Beijing, he knocked on an embassy's door. Whose door was it? Was it Germany? Was it France? Was it Switzerland? Was it Russia? It was our embassy. Why? Because that's America. It's what we represent. That's why people will swim through shark-infested waters to escape communist Cuba. That's why people crossed the Berlin Wall being shot at by their fellow East German comrades to escape to freedom. If we don't get this right, if America doesn't re-elect Donald Trump, if we don't win this contest with a nation that seeks to destroy us, I'm going to ask my fellow Americans, whose embassy door are you going to knock on?
Thank you, Dr. Gorka. Thank you all. Thank you, Nan Su. Thanks, Josh Phillip. Thank you, Larry O'Connor, Doug Steffen, John Fredericks, Dr. Chang, Dr. Gorka. Thank you all. I want to, on behalf of Talkers Magazine, thank you for coming. Those of you who've watched this on video, hope that it was a meaningful viewing and listening experience for you. And I want to thank our friends at the Epoch Times for the work that they're doing. And let's hope that things work out better than some of the dire observations might indicate that were presented on this panel. Thank you all, and have a nice day.